Now, before we start creating our cool projects, there's a couple more things I need to introduce. One of them is a function. A function is a super important part of Node.js. It lets you rerun the same set of code multiple times with different input. Let's say I wanted to create a function that greeted a user. I could let someone call the function with no input, and I would greet the user as hello world. I could also pass in their name, in which case I could specify a specific greeting, like hello Michael or hello Jennifer. Either way, a function can do all of this awesome stuff, so instead of talking about it, let's dive right in. First up, as always, creating a new file. I'm going to add a new file into Node Basics. I'm going to call it functions.js. Now we're good to go. When you want to create a function, there's 4 main parts. First up, you have to use the function keyword. You can simply type out function to do that. This lets JavaScript know you're about to define a new function. Right after the function keyword, you have to name your function, much the same way that you would name a variable. In this case, I'm going to call my function greetUser with a capital U. Notice I still use camel casing even when naming a function. All right, that's part 1 and 2. Function keyword, name for the function. Part 3, I'm going to brush over for now. All I need you to do is, after a space, open and close a set of parentheses. And up next, I want you to open and close a set of curly braces. Inside this curly braces, that's part 4. This is the code you want to run. Just like an if statement, you can hit an enter right inside of the curly braces, and Sublime Text is automatically going to format them like this. The open brace on the same line as the function name, and the closing brace on a line by itself. Note that you don't have to put a semicolon anywhere after this line or after this line. Since we're dealing with curly braces, you can ignore the semicolons. Right now, this function does absolutely nothing. Let's make our function do something. In this case, I'm simply going to have it print hello world. To do that, I'm going to use console.log. Inside of parentheses and inside of quotes, we're going to be calling hello world. Perfect. All right, now that the function does something, we actually have to call it. When I say call a function, I mean run a function, execute a function. Any of those words can be used interchangeably. Down below, right after I define the function, I want to call it. To call a function, you do 2 things. First, you have to specify the function name. In this case, that name is greet uppercase U user. The second part is to open and close a set of parentheses. Now, once again, this parentheses and these parentheses, they mean something. I'm going to talk about that in just a moment. For now, we're just simply going to add an opening and closing parentheses with nothing inside. All right. Now, this function should be called. Let's go ahead and run the file from the terminal and see what happens. To do that, I'm going to use the node command. After a space, I'm going to type out the file name, which is functions.js. Hit the enter key, and you can see hello world prints to the screen. Fantastic. Now, over here in functions.js, I can call this function multiple times. By typing the function name, opening and closing parentheses, and putting a semicolon at the end. Save the file, or rerun it from the terminal. Now you can see hello world prints to the screen 2 times. Very cool. All right, so you know how to create a function and you know how to call a function. Let's introduce another great part about functions. That is arguments. When I want to add arguments to a function, I can create them right inside of the parentheses where I define the function. Think of an argument as a variable that's only accessible inside of the function. For the greetUser function, I'm going to add a name variable. Now, just like a variable anywhere else in my application, I can reference it. What I'm going to do is replace the word world with whatever the name variable is. To do that, I need to open and close some quotes. After the plus sign, I'm going to concatenate the variable name. And then after the variable name, I'm going to concatenate an exclamation point. Perfect. Now, by default, name isn't going to have a value at all. It's going to be what's called undefined in JavaScript. An undefined variable is nothing. It's not a number, it's not a string, it's its own type called undefined. To pass a value into name, we have to add something inside of the parentheses when we call the function. It follows the exact same format as up here. In this case, I'm going to be passing in two strings. The first time I call greet user, I'm going to pass in my name, Andrew. So I simply put inside of quotes, Andrew. Now you might notice that this is actually identical to what we've been doing with console log all along. Log is actually a function, and it takes as an argument the thing to print to the screen. So you're actually already pretty familiar with passing arguments to a function. Now in the second call to greet user, I'm going to pass in a string as Jen. Now I can run the file from the terminal, and you can see hello Andrew and hello Jen print to the screen. Perfect. All right, let's keep things moving. One thing to point out, you can add as many arguments as you want. To add another argument right after the name argument, I can type a comma, a space, and then specify anything else, like last name. Now I have two variables accessible inside of my function, the name variable and the last name variable. Down here in my call to greet user, I can specify a couple last names. I do that the exact same way, a comma, followed by a space, followed by the argument to be passed in. In this case, it's going to be a string, and inside of the string, I'm going to type my last name, Mead. For Jen, I'm going to add a comma after the first argument, a space, and then inside of quotes, I'm going to type J. All right, now we actually pass in two arguments, and we have two registered up here, but we're not using them inside of the call to console log yet. To do that, I'm going to add a space. Then I'm going to concatenate the last name variable followed by the exclamation point. Now it's going to greet the user. So hello, name, space, last name, and then an exclamation point. Once you have it looking like this, you can rerun it from the terminal, and you can see we now have our two arguments being passed into console log, first name and last name. Awesome. All right, we've covered a lot of stuff with functions. One last thing, and this is a pretty important one. Right now, our function simply prints a message out to the screen. It's not very useful. We're not going to be doing a heck of a lot of that in this program. What we want to do is have a function run some sort of computation, whether it's fetching a to-do item from a database or saving a new user to the database, and we want to get that value back. In this case, let's change the greet user function. Go ahead and delete the console log line and follow along. To return something from a function, you use the return keyword. Now, return can only be used inside of a function, and it can only be used once. Here, I can return whatever I want. Just one value, but it could be anything. It could be the number 12. This is perfectly valid. It could also be a string, like Andrew. It could also be another function, but we'll get to that later. For now, let's simply recreate that string we passed to console log, but let's recreate it right after the return keyword. So to do that, we're going to reference the string hello, space. After hello, we're going to concatenate name. This is identical to what we had before. After name, I'm going to add another space, adding a plus sign to concatenate last name, followed by one more plus sign and an exclamation point inside of single quotes. Awesome. Now, instead of printing the message to the screen, it's going to return it to whomever called the function. That means down here, we can actually save the result of the function call to a new variable. I'm going to create a new variable called greeting, and I'm going to set it equal to the call to greet user. Now, whatever gets returned from greet user is going to be stored in the greeting variable. That should be the string hello Andrew Mead. To show you that that's true, I'm going to add a console log after I call greet user. I'm going to simply pass in greeting to the log function. When you rerun this from the terminal, you can see you get the exact same result. Hello Andrew Mead. So instead of printing it by default in the greet user function, we actually just generate the string, and then down below we can do whatever we want with it. Maybe we want to save it to the database, show it on a web page, print it out to the log. So you've learned a lot about functions. You see how we can use the function keyword to create a new one. We can name a function just like we name a variable, and we can add function arguments. Lastly, we have the body of the function, where you can do whatever you want, and you can return a value if you choose. You noticed in the beginning we weren't returning anything, and that's totally legal. If you don't return anything from your function, kind of like what we did earlier when we simply called console log, undefined gets returned. We're going to talk a little bit more about what undefined is and what it means in a couple videos. For now, just think of it as the absence of a value. Now it's time for a quick exercise. I'm going to delete everything inside of my functions.js file, and here we go. What I want you to do is create a function called add that takes two arguments. The first is number A, the second is number B, and all I want you to do is add them up, return the value, call the function, and log out the returned value. So go ahead and create this add function, have it called a couple times, and save the result into a variable, log it out to the screen, and when you're done, click play. All right, hopefully you were able to do that. Here's how I would have done it. First up, I need to create that add function. To do that, I'm going to call the function keyword. Then I'm going to name my function. In this case, it's just going to be add. Then I'm going to open and close my parentheses. Inside of here, I know I want the function to take two arguments. The first, I'm going to call A, and the second, I'm going to call B. Now that I have A and B, I can close the parentheses and open and close my curly braces and hit the Enter key. Very cool. Now we can actually add the numbers up and return them. To do that, we're going to use the return keyword, and then we're simply going to call A plus B semicolon at the end. All this line does is it takes A plus B, which could be 1 plus 2 or 6 plus 6, and it's going to return that value to whoever called the function. Perfect. Let's go ahead and use this new add function. I'm going to create a variable first to store the result. So I'm going to use the var keyword. I'm going to call my variable result, and I'm going to set it equal to whatever gets returned from add. In this case, I'm going to call add with two arguments. The first is going to be the number 1, and the second is going to be the number 88. Put a semicolon at the end, and you'd expect the result variable to equal 89. Let's go ahead and prove that by calling console log and passing in the result variable. On the next line, console.log, inside of parentheses, result. Perfect. When I run the file from the terminal, you can see 89 prints to the screen. Very cool. So that's all you have to do to add two numbers together and return them from a function. Let's talk about a couple things you might have done differently. Inside of the function, you could have created a new variable, called it result, set it equal to, let's say, A plus B, and then simply returned that variable. So instead of doing the math right here on the same line as the return keyword, you would simply type result. You can have as many lines as you want inside of a function, although it's best to make sure your function doesn't get too long because it can become a pain to debug. In this case, though, we are more than okay with having 2 lines. Now, we can actually do a couple things a couple other ways as well. Down below, since we're simply storing the value in result and then logging it out, we can actually write this just like this. Console.log, and inside of parentheses, we can call add. We can open and close the parentheses for the arguments to add, and we can type in 3, 2. Now, this is going to do 2 things. First, it's going to call add with 3 and 2, which should return 5. Then it's going to take that number 5 and it's going to pass it into console.log. So we'd expect 5 to print to the screen just below 89. If you run that from the terminal, you can see that 89 and then 5 print to the screen. Perfect. Like many things in Node.js, there is a ton of different ways to do it. If you find that your projects turn out a little different than mine in terms of the code, that's perfectly all right. As long as the result's the same, the code itself doesn't matter too much. Now, obviously, if I'm introducing a new concept, it's important that you use that concept, but don't worry about different variable names or having a variable, say, created and then returned, as opposed to returned right here. No matter what you did, as long as you got the add function to work, congratulations, you have just created one of many functions you're going to make throughout this course. So stay tuned. In the next video, we're going to talk about objects, which is actually one of the most important and greatest parts of the JavaScript language.